Today we'll be beginning a new series on a work of Alasdair MacIntyre. MacIntyre is one of the most well-known and influential contemporary moral philosophers. He originally made his splash with this work in 1981, After Virtue, which involved a radical critique of contemporary moral philosophy and moral discourse more generally, and a call for a return to an older tradition in ethical theory, going back to Aristotle, that focused on the virtues as the central concept in ethics. And so it became one of the main texts of what became known as virtue theory. That was in 1981. He followed this in the 80s with two further works that together formed a kind of original trilogy of MacIntyre's mature moral philosophy. The next one was this one, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, which was intended to supplement After Virtue with an account of practical rationality. And as the title suggested, he sees practical rationality as being linked to justice, and the who's and the which indicate MacIntyre's abiding concern with ethical relativism and different conceptual schemes and frameworks that give rise to different ethical paradigms. So different paradigms of justice lead to different ideas about rationality, according to MacIntyre. Following this were his lectures, his Gifford lectures, which were in 1988. This is published in 1989, Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry. And here MacIntyre deals with fundamental and radical differences in approaches to moral philosophy, which he describes as encyclopedia, genealogy, and tradition. And this highlights the importance of the notion of a tradition in MacIntyre's moral philosophy. So those are his original three works. Then in 1998, I believe that's right, he published this work. Yes, 1999, rather. Dependent Rational Animals, which contains in a lot of ways the working out of ideas and concepts that I think are further developed in the work that we're going to be looking at, which is his latest major work, Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity. You can still see here the concern with the state of disarray that modern moral discourse finds itself in, which is MacIntyre's abiding concern ever since After Virtue. So this work, Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity, can be viewed in many ways as a kind of updating and expanding of this seminal work of his from 1981, After Virtue. It contains a lot of the same themes, but developed, one might say, more rigorously, more deeply, taking into consideration many decades of reflection since After Virtue. So we're going to be looking at this as a kind of paradigm of contemporary ethical theory and the latest installment in the Aristotelian tradition that has weighed so heavily in the history of Western moral philosophy. So MacIntyre begins this work with the discussion of desire and the good. The first section of the first chapter is entitled Desires, Why They Matter, What They Are, What It Is to Have a Good Reason for Desiring Something. And he begins by observing that lives can go wrong in a variety of ways. But he is going to be particularly concerned, he says, with lives that go wrong on account of misdirected or frustrated desire. And I think this is basically for MacIntyre an effort to motivate from the ground up, from a kind of existential perspective, a concern or an interest in the problems of moral philosophy. These aren't merely academic concerns or theoretical concerns, but they relate directly to the issues that matter most to people, namely how does my life go well? How can I do all that I can to ensure that my life will go well? And one of the issues that arises in this relation is whether my desires are of the right sort, whether they're on the right track, whether they're directed towards the right things. So examples of lives that go wrong on account of misdirected or frustrated desire, according to him, are first, wanting just one thing and failing to achieve it. We could imagine, for example, someone who all they ever wanted to be in life was a police officer, but then they don't get into the academy. Or maybe they become a police officer, but in the very first month of becoming a police officer, they get involved in a controversial shooting, officer-involved shooting or something like that, and they're never able to be a police officer again. So if that was the only thing they wanted to achieve, this, of course, would be disastrous for their happiness, and their lives would have gone badly wrong in their own eyes. So wanting just one thing and failing to achieve it, wanting to be an actor, not being able to make it as an actor, wanting just to be a model and not being able to make it as a model, and then having to admit at a certain point that you're never going to make it. That's one way in which desire can lead lives to go wrong. If you want just one thing and you fail to achieve it. Also wanting too many things and failing to achieve anything because of divided attention. Never being able to persevere or sustain in anything. So one week you decide that you're going to start a rock band, but before you're able to really get good enough at your instrument, you get distracted and you decide maybe you want to be a painter instead. So you start painting. And then you decide, well, I'm not selling any paintings, maybe just at the point where you're starting to get good at painting, and so you go on and try something else. So that's an example of your life going wrong because you desire too many things and you fail to achieve anything because of divided attention. Or wanting too little out of fear of disappointment. Maybe you did always want to be an actor. And maybe you really had the talent to be an actor, but you were too afraid of taking that leap. And so you never put your talents and skills to adequate use, and you ended up being frustrated and disappointed in your life because you never really found anything you wanted to do. One question to ask about such cases. Did they desire what they had good reason to desire, given their circumstances, character, relationships, and past history? That, MacIntyre thinks, is an important philosophical question, but also just an important life question, a practical question. How do we know that we had good reason to desire what we desire? Always, of course, relative to our circumstances, our particular character, the relationships we find ourselves in, and our past history. To address this question, MacIntyre thinks that we should first note some other features of desires. First, they have a large variety of objects. There are a large number of desires. So on page 2, gives an example meant to illustrate the wide variety of desires. So he's talking about imaginary people here. She wants, among other things, a cup of coffee, to solve this differential equation, to join the theater group, never to have to return to South Bend, Indiana. He wants to lose weight, to be successful as a teacher, to visit Florence before he dies. What they want is that such and such should be the case at some point in the future. Yet what we desire for the future is sometimes that things should continue just as they are now. She is well-liked and wants to go on being well-liked. He is the proud owner of a Bugatti and wants to go on being the proud owner of a Bugatti. Moreover, we often desire not only that things should go well for us, but also that they should go well or badly for particular others. She wants her friend to do well in her examination and the local food bank to flourish. He would be delighted if something very bad happened to the salesman who cheated him when he bought the Bugatti. So that just gives an illustration of the range of desires that people can have, the multiplicity of desires. They have a large variety of objects. Also, desires are different from felt needs. Felt needs, at least in human adults. Maybe not in babies. Maybe in small children, their desires and their felt needs are exactly the same. But for adults, we have to consider whether or not we should forego some present desire for the sake of some future possibility. Adults are aware that their desires, as MacIntyre puts it, have a history. My desires have a history, that my desires have changed in the course of my life. I don't desire now what I desired when I was 11 years old. When I was 11 years old, I desired to have a complete set of the Frank Miller Daredevils or something like that. Today, I desire to have a complete set of Aristotle, which in fact I do have. And I desire to continue to have a complete set of Aristotle. So desires change, and they multiply in the course of their lives, in the course of one's life. I have desires for things now that I never had a desire for when I was younger. Single malt scotch, for example, was not something I had a desire for when I was 11. Other aspects of the history of our desires. This history is also inseparable from our biochemical and neurophysiological development. So everyone recognizes that our desires have something to do with just our physical embodiment and the physical and chemical, biochemical, biophysical processes that our body is subject to. It gives examples on the bottom of page 3. Our emotions are obviously closely related to our desires. We become angry when some harm that we very much did not want to see inflicted on a friend is gratuitously inflicted on him. We grieve when someone whose well-being we desired falls ill or dies. So too with our tastes and our affections. I want tickets for this concert because of my liking for this kind of music. I want the radio turned off because of my aversion to that other kind of music. I want this student to do well because of my affection for her parents. Desires can also be affected by various illnesses and drugs, as studied by neuroscientists. Alcohol, nicotine, marijuana, he mentions. Desires are also affected by our habits and beliefs. So, to stick with the music example, if I consciously cultivate the habit of listening to a certain type of music, I may come to desire listening to it when I didn't before. In fact, I believe I saw in a documentary once that the music industry actually has deals with major big box stores, malls, and so forth to pump some of this horrible music that passes for pop music these days into those spaces. And people generally don't like it at first, but they hear it enough and they come to desire listening to, Kesha or whoever. So to address the question why it's important to focus on desires, MacIntyre asks us to consider two types of occasion which give us good reason to reflect upon our desires. Two types of occasion which give us good reason to reflect upon our desires. So, at what times are we, as it were, called upon to reflect upon our desires? Well, first, there are occasions when we cannot avoid making choices that will determine the shape of our future lives. So, vocational discernment for a young person, for example. When they you finally have to declare a major and decide what you're going to do with your life. Or you have to decide whether you're going to go to college at all or into the military. Or perhaps you have to decide in certain contexts whether you're going to pursue a religious life, a religious vocation, like being a contemplative nun, for example, or whether you're going to get married and have a family. Those sorts of decision-making times call for us to reflect upon our desires. What do I want? Second, life disruptions. So war and natural disaster that perhaps upends one's life. Divorce is a common one. Friend alienation. You discover that all your friends secretly think you're a racist and they decided to shun you or something like that. Sudden illness is another example of a life disruption. And this causes us to ask, what should I do? What am I going to do now? Now I'm divorced, and all my friends were my spouse's friends, and they don't want anything to do with me. My boss was, my spouse's father, and so they fired me. Now what am I going to do? And we need to answer this question. And MacIntyre says, well, if you want to answer this question, what shall I do? We had better pause and pose the question, what is it that I want? What is it that I want? And that requires us to think critically and to ask questions like, is what I now want what I want myself to want? So often in the course, let's say, of losing a job, perhaps you had a high-paying job, and you feel that you lost your job, and got laid off in an economic downturn, and you feel like you're never going to be able to get a job like that again, that high-paying, and you become despondent and so on. But perhaps it's important for you to ask, well, do I really want money? Is it important to me that I have that degree of material comfort, or do I want something else? Do I have sufficiently good reasons to want what I now want? I might have reasons. I might, for example, become devastated when I don't, after the third try, I don't get into any law schools. And my parents are both lawyers. They expected me to be a lawyer. And so I feel devastated. But I have to ask, do I have sufficiently good reasons to want to be a lawyer? If I ask myself, well, what's the reason? Well, of course, it's because mom and dad want me to be a lawyer. That's always been my reason. But is that a sufficiently good reason? So these are just examples. But concern with the accurate answering of these questions, in turn, leads me to ask the question, who am I? What kind of person am I? And that leads to the question of how I became the person that I am. The history of my desires, or at least MacIntyre links this to the history of my desires. And that's itself kind of an interesting point, that my sense of my identity seems to be closely bound up with my sense of my desires, which, as we mentioned earlier, has a history. So how did I come from being the person who, desired above all else to have a complete collection of Frank Miller's Daredevils, to being a person whose desire above all else was to teach philosophy? How did I get from there to there? These are things that tell me who I am if I ask myself these questions. So, okay. Drawing all this together, whether life goes well or badly depends upon whether, when I'm in this crucial situation of asking myself what I want, whether someone thinks well or badly of their present, past, and future desires. Whether life goes badly depends upon whether someone thinks well or badly of their present, past, and future desires. MacIntyre says on page 5. So I can come to decide, actually philosophy is worthless. I should never have desired to become a philosophy teacher. This is useless. I may decide that it's not a sufficient reason to go to law school, that my parents want me to go to law school. I may come to have a wish that I didn't desire the things that I have desired in the past. And I may come to think badly of my past desires. So what is it to think well or badly of our desires? How is that even possible? Well, this leads us to the more philosophical questions, philosophical sounding questions, as opposed to the kinds of questions that you might grapple with your therapist. And that is the question, what is desire? What is a desire? What is a desire? Anyway, what is the relation of desires to actions? So in answering this question of what is desire, MacIntyre begins with Elizabeth Anscombe's remark, the primitive sign of wanting is trying to get. The primitive sign of wanting is trying to get. So it's a sure sign, maybe not a sure sign, but a good sort of first blush guess at what a person wants to look at what they're actually trying to get. That seems to be the idea there. But in adults, of course, oftentimes we want things that we're not actively trying to get for various reasons. And so immediately MacIntyre translates this into terms of dispositions to do certain things. We can think of a desire as a disposition to do certain things. So wanting to go to Italy entails being disposed at the appropriate time, if it's possible, to buy a plane ticket, to make a hotel reservation, etc., etc. Doesn't mean I'm doing it, but I can have a desire to go to Italy that doesn't manifest itself in my life. But if the time came, that desire would manifest itself in terms of those actions. There's a spectrum concerning the expression of desires in action. So at one extreme, there are desires that we might have that are never expressed in action, and they couldn't be expressed in action. MacIntyre calls these idle wishes, like wanting to sing like a virtuoso. You know, you might be a big fan of one of these contestant shows where they have singing, The Voice or American Idol or these sorts of things, and you say to yourself, "Wow, I really want to be able to sing like that," but you recognize you never will be. But still, it's a kind of desire. It's a kind of idle desire. It's an idle wish. It's barely a desire. Some people would say it's not a desire. That desire and wish are two different things. But MacIntyre might be prepared to countenance the idea that there's a kind of a limit case of desire. At one extreme is idle wishes. And at the other would be desires that translate immediately into action. So, you know, my desire, which I'm certain will arise in the near future, to have a drink of water as my throat gets dry in this dry climate, will immediately express itself in action. There won't be any thinking about it. I'll have the desire, and then like that, it will be expressed in action. Whereas my desire to be a great singer will never be expressed in action because I utterly lack any singing ability. And then there will be a range of cases in between where we'll have different degrees of disposition to act versus actually acting on the desire. Also, sometimes when my desire is that things remain as they are, my desire may be expressed by letting things be. I can express a desire sort of just passively in that respect. I desire that the furniture, in my house remain as it is, and so how do I express that desire? By doing nothing. Also, there's a kind of way in which you might attune ourselves, but still in a kind of passive sense. If I'm extremely bored and what I want is any sort of change, my desire may be expressed by receptiveness to variety. I become, you wouldn't know that by looking at me, but, if someone just comes along and suggests, hey, you want to take a road trip? I'm there right away. Right? Even any kind of crazy thing that someone might propose that I never would have thought of doing before, I might be disposed to do it just out of boredom. So it's a kind of attunement that I'm in, a state of attunement I'm in that expresses my desire. It's not an actual action, but it's just a kind of way in which I am sensitized, so to speak. If what I want is that my desires should be otherwise than what they are, then my efforts will be directed towards redirecting my attention, conditioning myself not to respond to certain stimuli, and so on. So there are all kinds of ways in which desire can express itself in action. Next, MacIntyre talks about the ways that habits and routines transform our desires, as do beliefs. So a person might be satisfied with their life only because she believes there's no other alternative. This pertains to what a person believes is possible, which relates to the imagination. Imagination is connected to desires too, right? Why don't you desire to be the mayor of your city? I couldn't imagine myself being the mayor of the city. So my desire is limited, even though that might be something that would be very satisfying to me. So belief and imagination combine to limit desires. In acting, each of us has to take into account the desires of those with whom we interact as well. whether we love or hate or fear or are competitive with them. And it matters to us, MacIntyre observes, that our beliefs about others' desires are true beliefs. If people matter to us, that implies that it matters to us to know what they desire. And sometimes we may find it difficult to believe that other people could really desire what they seem to desire. We think, well, how could anyone want that? The person becomes unintelligible to us. They become strange to us because we come to be aware that they desire this thing that we don't understand how they could desire that. The questions that we ask when attempting to make sense of the desires of others are similar to the questions we pose to ourselves when we become reflective about our own desires. And MacIntyre says on page 8, quote, "To be reflective about one's desires is to ask whether one has sufficiently good reasons for desiring whatever it is that one presently desires." Unquote. To be reflective about one's desires is to ask whether one has sufficiently good reasons for desiring whatever it is that one presently desires. Page 8. Also on page 8, quote, "To have a good reason for desiring something is to have a good reason for acting in some particular way." Unquote. To have a good reason for desiring something is to have a good reason for acting in some particular way. So what is it to act for a good reason? According to MacIntyre, once again, quote, "To act for a good reason is to act for the sake of achieving some good or preventing or avoiding some evil." To act for a good reason is to act for the sake of achieving some good or preventing or avoiding some evil. So we see here that in this claim, let's take note of this view, talk about it a bit. To act for a good reason is to act for the sake of achieving some good or preventing, avoiding some evil. So the good reason, the idea of reason, is going to be subordinate to the idea of there being these goods out there. And this is a view that we've seen previously in Aristotle, in Aquinas, in Mill. So it's a continuing thread in the Western tradition, but interpreted in different ways by different philosophers. I just want to point that out. Many people would agree with this, at least verbally, but they would understand it in different ways because of their different understandings of the relationship between the reason and the good. But all would say that yes, the reasons, good reasons for action are in some sense subordinate to reasons for doing good. Now, someone may have a good reason to act without knowing that they do. Right? So there could actually be some good that you could produce in a particular circumstance, but you don't know it, so you don't act for that reason. Maybe you still act to produce the good, but not for the reason that exists. You could act to produce something that's good, but for a bad reason. So the claim is not that if you act to produce some good, ipso facto, you have a good reason for doing it. But rather, the claim is if you have a good reason, it's because there's some good that's being produced. Also, of course, you could have a good reason, but without actually acting on that reason at all. So you could know that, I have a good reason to do this thing, but you don't do it. And the good in question may be achieved simply by performing the action, directly by performing the action, like, helping a little old lady across the street or something. You immediately produce the good in performing the action, or in contributing to a cooperative effort. So you believe you're doing good by getting vaccinated against COVID because you're helping to build up the herd immunity. Or it could be by a separate effect of an action down the road. So you believe that, by saving money out of your paycheck down the road, you're contributing to stable retirement or something like that, which is an effect that will be achieved later. MacIntyre says also on page 8, quote, "We have a good reason to want some particular object of desire only if and when to act so as to achieve the object of that desire is to act so as to achieve some good." So we have a good reason to want some particular object of desire only if and when to act so as to achieve the object of that desire is to act so as to achieve some good. So to have a good reason, not necessarily a sufficient reason, but to have a good reason justifying some desire, the object of that desire must be connected to some good, to the achievement of some good. In short, the question whether I have a good reason for a particular desire is really a question what good or goods are or might be at stake in my acting so as to satisfy that particular desire rather than some other. Do I have a good reason for having this desire that I have? Well, what good is at stake if I satisfy that desire? That's going to determine whether I have a good reason for that desire. Again, to have a good reason is not necessarily to have a sufficiently good reason. Also, one can have a good reason to want something, but a better reason to want something else. So this is to say that you have a good reason isn't necessarily to say that you took the best course of action, or that you even took the course of action on that reason at all. One could have a good reason for doing one thing, but you choose to do something else because you have a better reason to do that. Or because you believe that even though you have a good reason to do this, you don't have a sufficiently good reason. At this point, MacIntyre considers an objection, which is, don't we always have a reason for acting as we did? Namely, doing that got me what I wanted. And isn't that a sufficient reason? Isn't getting what I wanted a sufficient reason? He responds that this can be taken as the claim that it's good that this particular desire of theirs should have been satisfied. And this is true in some particular circumstances. Some particular circumstances, it's good that your desire should have been satisfied. However, we can also take this as the more radical suggestion that any desire provides some reason for acting so as to satisfy that desire. Is that true? Is the mere presence of a desire a sufficient reason for acting on that desire? The problem is, if the desire in question can't be understood as achieving some good, then it's not even intelligible as an intended action, let alone justified. So, page 9, second half of the paragraph, second paragraph, he says, "We become intelligible to others just insofar as they can identify and understand as possible goods the goods that furnish us with reasons for desiring as we do and acting as we do. If, therefore, someone were to give as their sole reason for acting that they do, sorry, let me try that again. If, therefore, someone were to give as their sole reason for acting as they do that it achieves the satisfaction of some desire, without also claiming that in satisfying their desire they were achieving some good, they would have done nothing to make their action intelligible as an intended action, let alone to show that it is justified." So, if I start walking around with this, dry eraser around my head, and you ask me, "Why are you doing that?" And I say, "Well, I want to." And they say, "Well, what good is that? Are you like balancing? Do you think you're going to have a modeling career or something? You're working on balance and keeping your head straight?" Or I'm like, "No, I just want to." That doesn't make sense. You might start to think I'm a little bit, unbalanced, right? By having that desire. And what that is to illustrate is that there's this connection that goes deeper merely than even explaining or justifying our actions. It's between desire and goodness, because to connect our desire with the achievement of some good is what makes that desire make sense in the first place. Otherwise, we become unintelligible, even to ourselves, usually, if we have desires that we don't understand. So, according to MacIntyre's observation, then, desires can only play a role in practical reasoning because of the relationship between satisfying, not satisfying some desire and achieving or failing to achieve some end. That's why desires play a role in practical reasoning, because they're connected to achieving some good. And if they weren't connected to achieving some good, they could play no role in practical reasoning, because they wouldn't make anything rational. They wouldn't, I mean, just by appealing to a desire without any connection to the good, it doesn't make this action intelligible in any way. Okay. Now, MacIntyre notes that his position seems equivalent to Aquinas' position that we've looked at in our series on Aquinas, namely the position that every desire is for some good. And this, even though one might perhaps be willing to admit it based upon what I just said, it gives rise potentially to the objection that it can't account for cases in which it seems that someone desires something that's bad. But MacIntyre notes that this is due to a misunderstanding of Aquinas' point. It is possible to knowingly act from a desire for what is bad, for example, something that's harmful to you, for the sake of some good, for example, pleasure. So you say, I desire this cigarette, which is bad because it's harmful, but I do it for the sake of the pleasure that I get from meeting my nicotine fix. Better counterexamples to Aquinas' thesis would be, MacIntyre thinks, momentary whims and plainly neurotic desires, like OCD symptoms and things like that. Or whims like just deciding to, I think his example is you just kick a stone down the road just because you had a whim, right? Or you're walking down the street and you just pull a branch off a shrub along the way or whatever and start picking the leaves off, that kind of thing. MacIntyre thinks that these all have a characteristic of, quote, desires and intentions that the agents whose desires and intentions they are find themselves unable to make intelligible to themselves, let alone to others, unquote. That's on page 11. I'm not able to make intelligence. I don't know. Why did I shoot that albatross? I don't know. I do not know. Why did you do that? I can't make it intelligible why I did that. So MacIntyre thinks that Aquinas' view of the relation of desire and the good does hold good of our desires and intentions insofar as they're not momentary whims and insofar as they're intelligible. Then we could say that this claim that desire is a desire for a good does hold for those cases, at least. And these are the cases that, of course, we're concerned with in moral philosophy, desires insofar as they're subject to rational argument, justification, and things like that. Momentary whims and neurotic desires, let the psychiatrists deal with those. The neurophysiologist, perhaps. We present ourselves to others and they to us, MacIntyre says, as moved by desires for what we take to be good. Page 11. Insofar as the object of some desire really is a good, this provides us with a reason for acting so as to satisfy that desire. However, we might on occasion be mistaken about what the true object of some desire is. That is, what would really satisfy it. And sometimes MacIntyre cites the work of William Desmond, work he did, about desires for some unknown object, desires that point to some as yet unacknowledged but felt lack in ourselves. I want something. I feel like something's lacking. Something's lacking in my life. I want something, but I don't know what it is. That's possible. But nonetheless, it remains true in these cases that to make a desire intelligible is to find the good that will be gained by satisfying it. That is, to make it understandable. I don't understand this feeling that I have that something's lacking in my life. Right? And to make that intelligible, what it is I want would be to discover, oh yeah, that was it. That was the thing that I was lacking. Okay, so MacIntyre is well aware that this account of rational desire only points to a further question. So it says that desire is always a desire for the good, and this naturally, of course, points to the question, what do we mean by the good? And the nature of good, the good, is famously problematic because of the range of disagreements over what is called good. MacIntyre thinks we need a way to understand these disagreements better and how they might be resolved. So this brings us to section 2, good, goods, and disagreements about goods. MacIntyre notes that philosophers, ancient and modern, have often commented upon the multiple and various ways in which we use the term good. So on page 13, we speak of good knives, good jam, good poems, good kings, but also of a good time to apply for a job and to make oneself scarce, a good place to take a vacation or build a prison, and good qualities to look for in candidates for public office. We say of someone that she is good with children, good at tennis, or good for nothing. These various uses of good are adjectival usages. So good is always used as an adjective modifying a noun. And the criteria for applying the term good depends upon the noun being modified. You can keep track of this. So in the first case, we have the adjectival use. And this depends on the noun being modified. So when we say, for example, that's a good knife, it's the adjectival use. MacIntyre asks, what's the underlying unity in these various adjectival uses of good and bad? And he first attempts what he calls a rough and ready characterization of what's meant by calling something good in this adjectival sense. And that's on page 13 as well, when he says, to say of something that it is a good something is to say that if you want or need that something for the reasons for which things of that kind or things viewed from that point of view are characteristically wanted or needed, then this particular something will meet your want or needs. So to say of something, let's plug an example in here. To say of something that it is a good knife is to say that if you want or need something for the reasons for which knives are characteristically wanted or needed, then this particular knife will meet your want or need. That's the idea. Next, MacIntyre notes two features of adjectival ascriptions of good. First, the extent to which people agree or disagree about what makes something good of its kind or from a particular point of view varies widely. So people might agree quite a bit about what makes a good jam, but disagree widely about what makes a good government. Second, to call something good in the adjectival usage is not necessarily to commend it or to express approval. So we can say that this person's a good thief, this person's a good forger, and we're not necessarily approving of them or commending them for being a good thief or a good forger. So those are the two features that are characteristic of adjectival usages, this usage. There might be a variety of ways in which people agree or disagree about what makes something good of its kind. And second, to call something good in this sense is not necessarily to commend it or express one's approval. These features of good constrain any successful account. A successful account will have to make these features intelligible. Now, to this adjectival usage, he adds a second distinct usage of the good, which is the predicative. And as he notes, this distinction between the adjectival and the predicative uses of good was first noted by the early 20th century British moral philosopher, W.D. Ross. As the name suggests, in this usage, good is not used to modify a noun, but rather as a predicate of a sentence. So this sense allows us to say things like, it's good to be a good friend, but bad to be a good liar. So this would be uses like this. It is good that ... So this in this use, we're expressing a kind of approval or commendation of whatever the subject is of this particular locution. It's the predicative use of good that allows us to express the sorts of complex disagreements that typically presuppose limited agreements. And MacIntyre gives an important example, kind of concrete examples of this, two concrete examples on 14 and 15, which I won't read here, but I encourage you to take a look at that in this work, page 14 and 15. The examples of Ferdinand and Isabella, who disagree about whether it's good to have good taste, and Edward and Eleanor, who disagree about whether it's good to recruit co-workers for a trade union. So we have a kind of an example from either end of the class spectrum there. And the point of these examples is disagreement occurs against a backdrop of agreement. Agreements make the individuals unproblematically intelligible to each other, but the disagreements over the rank ordering of goods are disagreements about what provides a sufficient reason for each to arrive at the conclusion at which he or she arrives. That's the point he makes on page 15. So oftentimes we find ourselves agreeing on things like Edward and Eleanor agree that it would be good to have a trade union, but they disagree about, whether it would be worth it for Eleanor to lose her job as a result. So the ethical disagreement on a course of action takes place against the backdrop of agreements. That's the point that he wants to make. And he notes that the context in which ethical disagreements occur can vary quite a bit. Sometimes the disagreements occur against a backdrop of widespread agreement. Other times the disagreement runs deeper. So he gives the example of a religious renouncer of pleasure versus a hedonistic epicure and sexual adventurer, where there's a much more radical disagreement about what makes life worthwhile, what makes human beings good human beings. And in those kinds of cases, the individuals may horrify each other and regard each other as pathological, as well as disagree because of the depth of their disagreement. So there's disagreements about goods, there's disagreements about the rank ordering of goods, and these can be expressed as disagreements about what persons in some situation have reason to desire. So MacIntyre, this suggests to MacIntyre that the question of what makes a good reason to desire something is bound up with the question, what are the parties to these sorts of disagreements disagreeing about? And how might their disagreements be resolved? So again, I encourage you to take a look at Ferdinand and Isabella and Edward and Eleanor again with those questions in mind. So what makes a good reason to desire something is bound up with the question, what are the parties to these sorts of disagreements disagreeing about? And how might their disagreements be resolved, if at all? MacIntyre suggests that in order to pursue this question, we need a philosophical account of locutions like it's good to or it's good that. What are we doing or saying when we use these phrases? This leads me to the first discussion question. Do you agree with MacIntyre's analysis of the relationship between desires and goods? Is it really necessary to sometimes question whether I have the right desires or want the right things? Does it make sense to do so? From what point of view can one ask such questions? Is MacIntyre correct in claiming that desires are made intelligible in relation to goods? What would you say about the inverse view that goods are made intelligible by desires? So this leads to the first discussion question. Do you agree with MacIntyre's analysis of the relationship between desires and goods? is it really necessary to sometimes question whether I have the right desires or want the right things? Does it make sense to do so? From what point of view can one ask such questions? Is MacIntyre correct in claiming that desires are made intelligible in relation to goods? What would you say about the inverse view, that goods are made intelligible in relation to desires? Okay. So in the second half of the chapter, or rather the beginning in the third section of this chapter, MacIntyre takes up the question of expressivist accounts of good and disagreements about goods. And here he begins his discussion of the first of two opposed philosophical theories about ethical statements that he's going to single out for special attention. The first is expressivism, and the second is his preferred view, which is he calls Neo-Aristotelianism. So expressivism is a theory that developed out of, or evolved out of, you might say, an early 20th century theory known as emotivism. And sometimes these are both grouped under the label of non-cognitivism. Because they deny ethical knowledge, that there's facts to be known contained in ethical assertions. Emotivism's founder was a British philosopher by the name of Charles L. Stevenson. And Stevenson distinguished what he called descriptive meaning, which expresses true or false beliefs, from emotive meaning, which expresses attitudes of approval and disapproval. So in the classic formulation of emotivism, which claims, again, that ethical statements have emotive meaning only, not cognitive meaning or descriptive meaning, he would interpret a statement like, "This is good," to mean, "I approve of this, do so as well." I approve of this, do so as well. That was the way Stevenson would understand this. And the emotivism, the emotive meaning is I'm sort of expressing my emotion, right? I'm expressing my attitude towards the thing, a kind of emotion of approval. So there's the approval, and neither part of this is really true or false. I suppose in a sense you could say, I might be lying and implying that I think I approve of this and I don't. That would be a kind of insincere expression of saying this is good. But typically I approve of this is expressing my attitude. It's expressing a kind of positive attitude towards the thing. And then that's coupled with the kind of, this is meant to capture the kind of imperatival force of ethical utterances, where it seems like you're making a demand on someone when you're saying this is good. And so Stevenson cashed that out in terms of the imperative, do so as well. Right? This is good means I approve of this, do so as well. That's emotivism. So on this view, disagreement over beliefs and disagreements over attitudes of approval and disapproval are fundamentally different. For the emotivist, ethical utterances are ultimately neither true nor false. Disagreements in attitude are all that they involve. And you can settle a disagreement in attitude by persuading others to adjust their attitude to one's own. So I say, this is good. That means, according to Stevenson, I approve of this. Do so as well. You say, this is not good. According to Stevenson, that means I disapprove of this. You should disapprove of it as well. So there's a disagreement. How do we adjust this disagreement? Not by discovering what the truth about the world is, but rather one of us has to adjust his or her attitude towards the other. And then when we achieve an agreement in attitude where we both approve or both disapprove, then the agreement is dissolved. And of course, it might not be. And in part, it might not be because it can't be resolved by appeal to some arbiter that is going to be contained within our experience. We can't do some kind of test to determine whether it's good or not, because it's just a matter of what attitudes are in us. Now, Stevenson saw ethical utterances as designed to persuade in this sense. As an ethical theory, emotivists, of course, face the challenge of explaining why it seems natural to us to speak of ethical facts or truths And they should respond, MacIntyre says, by saying the following, that it is a fact that, or it is true that, are merely ways of subjectively endorsing the statements they govern. That is, as a general theory of the meaning of truth, this is a minimal theory of truth. The minimalist view produces the minimal view of truth produces a kind of conformity or harmony between ethical theory and the theory of truth. Because now, if truth itself is just a matter of my endorsing something, then that brings that much closer, of course, to the idea in the emotivist view of the good, that I'm just approving of something when I judge something to be good. But at the same time, the minimalist view can preserve Stevenson's distinction between assertions that express some evaluative attitude and assertions that purport to tell us how the world is. Because it can be one thing to endorse a statement about how the world is, and another to endorse some statement that expresses an evaluative attitude. Now, a kind of classic objection to emotivism, one that MacIntyre considers, is that it can't account for commonplace moral arguments that depend upon a conditional major premise. So, for example, if I say conditionally, it's bad to take pleasure in the misfortunes of others. Let me try again. If I say conditionally, if it is bad to take pleasure in the misfortune of others, then those who do so should be condemned. It's bad to take pleasure in the misfortune of others, therefore those who do so should be condemned. So that's my argument. If it's bad to take pleasure in the misfortune of others, then those who do so should be condemned. It is bad to take pleasure in the misfortune of others, therefore those who do so should be condemned. And the problem with this argument is that the first premise is conditional, and so it can't mean what the emotivist says that premise 2 means. I should probably elaborate upon that more, but we're a bit short on time, so I'm going to have to leave it in that form. Perhaps we can discuss if that was a little bit confusing. But the point is, more broadly, and it's not just on this point, but in other ways as well, emotivists have been charged with being unable to give a plausible account of the way that moral argument actually takes place. That sometimes we can make moral arguments in terms of hypotheticals, and that this sort of analysis of what moral judgment is doesn't readily allow that to be the case. Now, the expressivist, Simon Blackburn, tried to fix Stevenson's theory by reconstruing the meaning of evaluative sentences. According to Blackburn, to assert an evaluative sentence is to endorse it. Thus, someone who asserts, the first premise in this argument, which was, if it's bad to take pleasure in the misfortunes of others, then those who do so should be condemned. Someone who asserts that endorses that sentence. I endorse the view that if it's bad to take pleasure in the misfortune of others, then those who do so should be condemned. Kind of complex endorsement. And then I also endorse the second premise. It's bad to take pleasure in the misfortunes of others. And so this allows you to make sense of these kinds of arguments. So, in short, Blackburn comes along after Stevenson, sympathetic to Stevenson's kind of program for ethical theory, but aware of these objections that have been raised to it, and makes a modification that is able to deal with these objections. Now, the subsequent discussions of Blackburn's work in academic philosophy suggests that there is not going to be any agreement as to whether expressivism is an acceptable ethical theory anytime soon. MacIntyre observes that no decisive argument has been mounted against expressivism, nor is it likely to be mounted. However, at the same time, expressivism hasn't been able to convince its opponents that some view like this is the correct view. Well, all of this actually is really just stage setting for MacIntyre's examination of the expressivist theory of the good. He takes as the exemplar of this theory one prominent contemporary expressivist, Alan Gibbard, emeritus of the University of Michigan. Gibbard holds the view that to call something good is basically to say that it is warranted according to a norm that the speaker is expressing allegiance to. So Gibbard's expressivism is not holding that one is expressing one's feelings or attitudes, but rather one's holding of a norm. So according to expressivism, this is good means something like, this is rough, but something like this. This is approved according to a norm I am committed to. This is approved according to a norm that I am committed to. I judge, I'm committed to the norm of treating everyone equal, the norm of equality. And so when I say something like racism is bad, we could cash that out in terms of saying, well, this is disapproved by the norm of equality that I'm committed to. So a norm is something that says you ought to have certain preferences. And there's a lot that could be said about what a norm is. But ultimately, it involves this idea of individual preferences, personal commitments, but at a kind of a deeper level. Because for Gibbard, commitments to norms is more than merely an individual preference or merely a personal commitment, but it has something to do with a kind of psychological state nonetheless. Now, we have a great deal of agreement in the norms that we've accepted, and that accounts for the significant agreement we see regarding criteria for assessing the goodness of actions or objects. However, sometimes we also disagree in the norms that govern our judgments. And for Gibbard, the possibility of resolving disagreements that are that fall outside, let's say, the agreement over norms, the possibilities for resolving such disagreements are going to be limited by the preferences of the parties to the dispute and the differences in the norms they accept. So if you find yourself debating with someone, for example, who just isn't committed to the norm of equality, and to your horror, after a while in the conversation, you come to realize that this person, is just not committed to the norm of equality, then that's going to limit the possibilities for you agreeing with that person. If there isn't a basic agreement in preferences and norms, then there's nothing else to which the parties could appeal to settle their dispute. In particular, and this is the important point about expressivism, there's no matter of fact independent of the preferences and the norms of rationality to which one can appeal, according to expressivism. There's, the bedrock is the commitment to the norms of rationality. And if there's disagreement in those norms, then there is nothing else to which one can appeal with one's interlocutor in a disagreement to settle the dispute. MacIntyre notes that for Blackburn and Gibbard, there's also no opposition between reason on the one hand and passion or desire on the other. Reason is ultimately underwritten by underlying psychological states, for example, passions and desires, or however we understand the psychological source of our preferences and our commitment to norms. Remember, the commitment to norm, whatever it is some kind of a psychological state. Expressivists have typically held that only such an account can explain how moral judgments motivate. Only such an account as theirs can explain how moral judgments motivate. They hold that views that see morality as based upon supposed moral matters of fact are unable to explain how morality motivates us. So, if we suppose, well, there's a fact that it just is good, and it's good independently of anything that I care about, right? Well, how is that supposed to motivate me to do anything about it if it's independent of anything I care about? They would insist, and this goes all the way back to David Hume in the 18th century, they would insist that in order for any kind of moral judgment to actually be a true moral judgment, it has to be capable of motivating. Now, it's also characteristic of expressivism that they insist on a sharp distinction between the status of scientific assertions and ethical assertions. In science, the facts are what they are independently of anyone's attitudes or feelings. So, to concede in the scientific dispute that one might be an error, here's my hypothesis, but I could be wrong in this hypothesis in a scientific context. I say that, right? Here's my hypothesis, but I could be wrong. I could be an error. What am I saying there? Well, I'm saying that further data or considerations that might be discovered about the world might lead me to change my belief about how things are. By contrast, in ethics, although people may have the attitude that the badness of something does not depend on anyone's attitude towards it, you might think in MacIntyre's example that fox hunting is bad, and my attitude is I don't care what anyone else thinks, it's just bad. For the expressivist, this is merely your attitude. It's merely a particularly intense way of expressing your attitude. Attitudes depend only on the person's psychology, not on the way the world is independently of that psychology. To concede that I may be an error in an ethical judgment is to allow for the possibility only that I might be led to change my attitude. It's not to allow that I might be wrong about how things are. So if I say, I think fox hunting's okay, but I might be wrong, that's not to say that something can be discovered. It's just to say that, well, my attitude might change. I'm speaking of myself, not about the world. That's the contrast with science. Expressivists may appeal to irresolvable moral disagreements as a piece of evidence that bolsters this case for the distinction between science and morality. That is, they can say, well, look, we have all this agreement in science. That's because science is responsive to the data, to the way the world is, independently of people's opinions. So, a stubborn scientist is just going to be an unsuccessful scientist ultimately because they're not going to be able to explain the data. Whereas in the ethical sphere, a stubborn arguer for a moral position can just always, of course, dig in their heels because there is nothing apart from the person himself or herself that is responsible for the judgment. There's nothing about the world that this judgment is about. Do we have sufficient reason to accept expressivism? That's the question with which he concludes this section. Well, for MacIntyre, he says, as I noted earlier, I believe, in the philosophical debate over expressivism, expressivists have been given no decisive reason to change their mind. So it hasn't been refuted. You can say that for expressivism, MacIntyre thinks. It hasn't been refuted, even though, of course, some people obviously believe that they refuted it, but MacIntyre thinks that there haven't been at least reasons given sufficient to get the expressivist to change his mind. But we can't say that we ought to accept expressivism until we've compared it to other alternative and incompatible philosophical accounts. And as I mentioned earlier, MacIntyre's chosen theory to present as an alternative is what he calls Neo-Aristotelianism. And the key concept in Neo-Aristotelianism is the concept of human flourishing. So this is the concept that is incompatible with expressivism. That's why Neo-Aristotelianism provides a genuine alternative. He begins his discussion of Neo-Aristotelianism by making a number of observations about the scientific investigation of flourishing in non-human animals. For example, that this is on page 24, that the use of the concept of flourishing is uncontroversial among those who study non-human animals, that this concept requires a number of things, or flourishing itself requires a number of things. For example, to flourish an animal requires an appropriate environment, good health, developing their specific powers, the powers specific to their species, learning what they need to learn, bringing up their young appropriately, and achieving the ends that their biology determines them to achieve. What is good or bad depends upon the species to which they belong. So MacIntyre notes that what's good for a fox is not good for a rabbit, etc. What's good for a dolphin isn't good for a whale. When we say that an animal is doing well or badly, this is not based upon our psychological states. It wouldn't make any sense for me to say that, well, yeah, I know that coyote there is, obviously emaciated and mangy and is missing a leg, but, that looks like a perfect coyote to me. That's my attitude towards that coyote. People will look at you like you're crazy, right? Whether an animal is doing well or badly is an objective biological fact that has nothing to do with your attitude. Judgments are true or false based upon a standard, an independent, objective, natural standard, a standard independent of the observer. So Neo-Aristotelianism simply extends this account to humans. On page 25, MacIntyre says, quote, "When we compare future courses of action or states of affairs as better or worse, our standard will be how it contributes to or detracts from human flourishing." MacIntyre claims that when our evaluative language is in good order, as he puts it, when our evaluative language is in good order, and he'll have more to say about that later on, when our evaluative language is in good order, then this is what disagreements are about in ethics, whether or not it's conducive to something is conducive to human flourishing. Now, he's well aware of the objection that people often disagree about what it is to flourish as a human being. And he's also well aware that this suggests to many people that the notion of human flourishing is not properly scientific, like, let's say, the notion of coyote flourishing or dolphin flourishing. Now, he doesn't answer this important objection here, but he hints that he will try to make this apparent weakness into a strength. He writes, beginning at the bottom of 25, "On the view that I've begun to outline, rational inquiry into and consequent disagreement about what human flourishing consists in this or that set of circumstances, is itself one of the marks of human flourishing. The fact that we can have rational disagreement about what human flourishing is itself a mark of human flourishing," which seems sort of paradoxical, but that's a marker really for future discussion down the road a bit. Now, there are, MacIntyre observes, key differences between human flourishing and the flourishing of non-human animals. For non-human animals, their environment is a given. Humans, on the contrast, have reshaped environments to fit their needs. Humans have changed themselves and have developed a greater range of powers than any other animal. Humans have language use, which has different crucial aspects, but the gist of it is it enables us to have rationality, to reflect, to predict, to tell stories, to envision alternative goals. All of these are functions of language, or the kinds of language that humans have. And these enhanced powers allow us to do other things that animals can't do, as well as to fail in ways that animals can't. Humans have an ability to learn from our mistakes. You might say animals do as well, but humans can learn from their mistakes in a more radical sense, perhaps MacIntyre wants to say. And so what has resulted from these human possibilities that go beyond what animals, non-human animals, can do, what has resulted is that humans have developed these powers in a great multiplicity of ways across different cultures. And these different cultures can be viewed as having different views about human flourishing. Of course, because of this, it's possible to argue that there's little comparison between the flourishing of non-human animals and human flourishing. However, MacIntyre thinks that these facts actually lend credence to the flourishing view. First, he says, we observe that within cultures, disagreements over what is good or bad tend to match disagreements about human flourishing. To the extent that individuals or groups and segments of the culture disagree over what's good or bad, that tends to also match the ways in which they disagree in their visions of human flourishing. Second, in most, if not all cultures, it is taken for granted that human flourishing is what that culture says it is. MacIntyre gives an example of the Javanese, but we can imagine, of course, the tendencies to believe, if you're an American, to believe that the American way of life is something very close to what it is for a human being to flourish. It's natural for Americans to believe all the world wants to come here, of course, because this is the place where human beings can flourish. The American life is the life of flourishing. So in most cultures, that seems to be the case. The way MacIntyre treats this is to say, well, different cultures are in fact presenting rival claims about a single subject matter. And in that respect, it's like having rival scientific hypotheses about the same subject matter. So, trying to understand the origin of the universe or whatever, you have different mathematical models. They're incompatible. But there's one subject matter that they're all trying to explain. And so that doesn't make them, of course, merely relative or subjective, because they're just competing explanations for this one single subject matter. That's the way MacIntyre wants to look at human flourishing. Different human cultures are, as it were, different theories about what human flourishing consists in. It's a little bit more complicated than that, as we'll see, but that's why this is not just a form of relativism. How can we stand back from our own culture's view of human flourishing and contrast that view and the views of other cultures with the reality of human flourishing? If there is such a reality, if there is an objective reality of human flourishing, how can we stand back from my view about human flourishing that's been inculcated in me because I was raised in this culture and ask, well, what is human flourishing really? And here's where MacIntyre thinks Aristotle can be of assistance. Aristotle developed, according to MacIntyre, a core conception of human flourishing that enabled him to move beyond his own culture and to stand back from it. So he sees four components of Aristotle's core conception of human flourishing. Aristotle recognizes the full range of human powers. This is on page 28. He recognizes the full range of human powers, so physical powers, intellectual powers, aesthetic powers, etc. Second, he sees that those powers are made possible by language, which enables us to direct ourselves theoretically and practically by reason. Third, he acknowledges that human beings achieve their rationality through their cooperation in political relationships. Man is a political animal, as he said. And fourth, he observes that we are directed by our upbringing to ends that we take to be goods. And if we've been adequately educated, we have some inchoate idea of what it would be for someone to achieve those ends in a way that would perfect their life, essentially. That's what MacIntyre says on page 29. And the core thought of the core conception of Aristotle is that to flourish is to function well. However, MacIntyre will depart from Aristotle, what Aristotle at least recognized as an implication of his theory, in saying that we can function well in a variety of ways. Even if Aristotle didn't always recognize this, this is one of the respects in which MacIntyre is Neo-Aristotelian rather than Aristotelian, because he wants to go beyond Aristotle and say, well, there's a variety of ways in which human beings can function well. And in particular, there's going to be historical variability, that what constitutes human flourishing in particular historical circumstances is going to be different from what constitutes human flourishing in other historical circumstances. MacIntyre also sees the possibility of agreement about what constitutes human flourishing as the outcome of moral disagreement and debate. Sometimes there may be a proliferation of disagreement and debate, but for MacIntyre, that's no reason to reject Neo-Aristotelianism, any more than it's a reason to reject cosmology or quantum mechanics, because there's a lot of disagreement and debate among scientists in terms of what the theoretical paradigm should be in those areas. Okay, so finally, to wrap up here, the dispute between expressivists and Neo-Aristotelians. What's at stake in this dispute? Well, the basic idea is that for the Neo-Aristotelian, human flourishing is a truth to be discovered, as opposed to an attitude to be adjusted. So For the expressivist, what constitutes the good is not a truth, nor is it something that's discovered, but for the Neo-Aristotelian it is. Human flourishing is a truth to be discovered. Expressivism, there is no such truth. Expressivists construe internal moral conflicts as conflicts between two different parts of the self. So if I have a strong desire and that conflicts with what I believe I have most reason to do, in the example that MacIntyre gives, that's a conflict for the expressivist, has a conflict between two different parts of the self. And MacIntyre suggests that in the deliberations that typically accompany such conflicts, expressivists push us in the direction of psychological self-analysis, which tends in turn to leads to debunking explanations, such as those offered by Freud and Nietzsche. That is, to psychologize my moral hang-ups, so to speak, right, as a kind of a neo-Freudian might believe. That I have this superego or whatever that's causing me to think that I don't have good reason to pursue my desire to be a pornographer or who knows, whatever. And so, I psychoanalyze it and I end up debunking moral belief. And MacIntyre views this as a kind of a deficiency. He calls it a lacuna in expressivism. It doesn't provide the psychological resources to resolve disputes between the two parts of the self in a rational way. So expressivism is incomplete in a practically important way. Now, MacIntyre admits that Neo-Aristotelianism is also incomplete, but in another way. It fails to explain the motive that a person has for adjusting her desires to match human flourishing. So, as an Aristotelian and a rational agent, the Neo-Aristotelian desires to desire only what practical reason dictates and what she has good reason to desire. But as an imperfectly rational agent, she might still lack the motivation to put into effect what she believes she has good reason to desire. So what will enable her to act rightly? And MacIntyre suggests that Aristotle, especially in his account of acrosia or incontinence, and also Aquinas, they provide tools to answering this question, to what enables a person to be motivated to do what practical reason tells her to do. But he says the account needs to be further developed and updated. So in short, he sees both expressivism and Neo-Aristotelianism as needing more work in order to fully defend themselves against the alternative possibility. Okay, let's conclude with the second discussion question. Based upon MacIntyre's initial preliminary characterizations, which of the two theories, expressivism and Neo-Aristotelianism, seems most cogent to you? What do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of each theory? Is there an alternative theory that you think MacIntyre should have considered as a possible account of the good? Explain. So, second discussion question. Based upon MacIntyre's initial preliminary characterizations, which of the two theories, expressivism and Neo-Aristotelianism, seems most cogent to you? What do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of each theory? Is there an alternative theory that you think MacIntyre should have considered as a possible account of the good? Explain your answer.